We acknowledge the first Australians as the traditional custodians of the continent, whose culture is the oldest living culture in human history. We pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and we respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. We extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. They share the memories, traditions and hopes of the traditional ancestors with the new generations today and in the future. We would also like to thank them for looking after this land for thousands of years.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next session of Earth Science Week, proudly sponsored by Geoscience Australia and hosted by Virtual Excursions Australia. So my name is Karen and it's great to have everyone back here again today. So we are focusing on our session today about exploring using ROVs. So I'm going to hand you over to Megan from the Australian National Maritime Museum. And just remember, if you have questions for our presenter, put it in the Q&A. But if your presenter asks you a question, you can put that in the chat. So I'll hand over to Megan and enjoy your session this afternoon.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am just going to pop my screen share up there. Perfect. All right. So welcome, everyone, to the Australian National Maritime Museum. And this is the amazing, beautiful building that I am presenting to you from today. My name is Megan, and I am the Digital Education Officer here, and it's an absolute pleasure to be chatting to you all about ROVs, which is a great, interesting type of technology that we use to explore beneath the surface of the water there that you can see in the video. Before I go any further, I will also just like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the Bamal, the earth, and the Badu, the water, of which I'm speaking to you from today. I also wish to acknowledge all traditional custodians of the lands and waters throughout Australia and pay our respects to them and their cultures and elders past, present, and emerging, because as the acknowledgement at the start said there, they've been looking after our land and our waters for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So now we can actually use technology and we can use First Nations knowledge to work together to look after all of our beautiful environment. And that's a really interesting thing that we can talk about for Earth Science Week today. But I keep talking about ROVs, this type of technology, but first we've got to work out what an ROV actually is. An ROV stands for remote operated vehicle, or remote controlled vehicle. So ROVs are driven with a remote control kind of like this. So remote operated vehicle is what we mean when we say ROV. And this is how we can drive these different shapes and sizes of ROVs all around under the water. So this is how an ROV is operated. So we can pop the ROV itself in the water, and then we can use the remote control to drive it around, which is pretty cool. Have a think. Has anyone here ever driven a remote control car? Put your hand up in your classroom or in the room you're learning in today. Or maybe a few people might have even driven a drone up in the air. This is very similar to both of those things. We're using a remote control to drive around and actually look underneath the water. Now, here at the museum, we've had two different types of ROVs. The first one that you've got the picture of there, and I've got one here, was our first type that we had. And these were called Tridents, was the brand. And they don't make these anymore, which is a little bit sad, but this was a great kind of beginner ROV for us here at the museum. And you can see it's got a camera. It's got some headlights. And it had this big, long, yellow cord that connects it to land. We then bought some more expensive ROVs called deep trekkers. And they are really useful for us. And they're what we're using at the museum now. So they come with lots of different parts. You can see here a picture of the box that they come in. They've got the ROV, they've got a remote control, they've got a tether, a big kind of cord that connects it, and chargers and things like that. But what can they do? So the ROVs that we have here at the museum at the moment, deep trekkers, they can go 200 meters below the ocean, the surface of the ocean. So they can go 200 meters straight down. They can go further away from us. So they can get much longer tethers if you want them to go further away, but 200 meters straight down. They weigh about over 8 kilos. They have 2 or 3 thrusters on them, a full HD camera, a screen so that you can see what you're doing on the remote control. And they last for up to 8 hours of battery life. So you can use them for a fair amount of time. Now, these are really, really useful technology, but now I've got a question for you. So remember, write your answer in the chat. There are many different uses and purposes that we can use our ROVs for. What do you think we might see with an ROV if we're driving it in the ocean? So one of these remote operated vehicles, what do you think we might see if we drive it in the ocean? All right, so we've got a couple of answers coming through. That is great. Oh, yeah, so we've got sea creatures. And yeah, like whales and coral and octopus, squids. Yep, sea life. Oh, that's a good answer. New species. So scientists can use ROVs to actually look for and potentially discover new species. And there are new species being found under our oceans every single year. Here's a fun fact for you while you keep thinking about what you might see. We actually know more about the surface of Mars than we do the bottom of our ocean. So if you're a scientist, if you want to be a scientist and want to discover new things, studying our oceans, pretty good place to start looking. All right, so I've got a year 3 class here saying sharks. Yeah, we might see sharks, seahorses, and seaweed. Yeah, we'd see lots and lots of seaweed. And I've had a couple of people here, Jack and Danielle, have said pollution. And that's something we also see a lot of, really sadly, in the harbour here and in other places around the world. ROVs see a lot of pollution. They've even found pollution in some of the deepest parts of our ocean, things like plastic bottles and cans and things like that. So why don't I show you a video of how we actually use our ROVs here at the museum, and you can keep thinking about what it's seeing. So the ROV, we go out onto one of the wharfs around the museum, and we very carefully lift it down, pop it in the water. Now you can see there it's connected by what we call a tether, a big long cord cable. And you'll see that wriggling out as I drive it away. And using this remote control, we have joysticks here. So we use the joysticks to be able to drive it. So hand up if anyone plays video games. You might play video games on a controller. Yeah, so this is kind of similar to that. But also you get different types of controllers depending on what ROVs. And scientists will also sometimes use them with a computer. They'll control it with like a laptop. Instead of a controller like this, they'll use a laptop to actually control it. But you can see there, we could see the oysters at the top. And now we're going down, we're seeing all the different seaweed. And this is literally right out the front of our museum. So yeah, we're seeing the water. So you got the blue water, and sometimes it's more harder to see if there's a lot of stuff in the water, if it's very murky. And sometimes it's beautiful and clear, depending on the conditions. And the current is making all the seaweed move. And we're floating back up. You can just see lots of tiny little fish there and the oysters. So that video is taken at high tide when the oysters were underneath the water. At low tide, the oysters are out of the water. And these are all these cables and ropes that are dangling underneath some of our wharves. And you can see all the stuff growing on them. So the ROV is really useful for actually looking at the pontoon and wharfs, looking at boats and actually seeing if there's stuff growing on them. And here we've got to the bottom. You can see the sandy bottom there. So it's about 4 meters deep in that part of Darling Harbour. But if you go out to where all the boats drive, it can be 10, 20 meters deep, get a lot deeper. And lots of seaweed. What's that? I think I just saw a fish. So we can see a fish there, and we can also see a little bit of white on the bottom, and I think that's a bit of rubbish. And sometimes when you're driving the ROV, it just looks blue. And that's where you've got to use other tools, like it's got a compass on it. So you can use your compass, you can use your depth reading and things to try and work out where you are. And then when it comes back up to the surface, you can see the ROV there. And when we're finished, we lift it out of the water very gently, making sure my sunnies don't fall off my head there. And making sure that we wash it off really well before we put it back in its box. We wash it off, we let it dry, we recharge it, so it's all good to go next time. But we don't just use it here at the museum, we also take it other places. And so here is actually Bondi Beach. And at Bondi Beach, there are some little rock swimming pools that you can see in the photograph there. And this is actually some of the little fish that are in those rock swimming pools. So this is where people are swimming and kids are playing and splashing about. And there are all these tiny little fish and all these very different types of seaweed, isn't it? It's very different to the environment here at the museum. And the ROV can actually drive pretty fast. So I loved this little corner of the rock pool with the different seagrasses and all of those little stripy fish. So that's what the ROV sees when it's underwater. Well, let's have a look at what it looks like. So this is at our museum again, and you can actually see I've got the light on the ROV, so it's got a big bright light. And it just sort of glides through the water there. The one in the video and the one taking the video both have claw attachments on them so they can grab stuff. But do you notice that big long string behind it? I've talked about the tether before. The big long string behind the ROV. You can see it there again. So it's both black right up close to the ROV, and then it becomes yellow. What do you think that does? Why do you think there is a cord connected to the ROV? Pop it in the chat if you think you have any ideas. I really like that answer. Oh, and that's a good answer too. Have another couple of moments. Very good. Everyone is right, pretty much. So it's got lots of multiple different reasons. Danielle has said, so we don't lose it. That's a really, really good reason. We don't want to lose it. It's pretty expensive. We don't want to lose it. So it's so that we can, if something goes wrong, we can pull it back and we can hoist it back up. Because just like any computer, occasionally it doesn't want to work and we have to turn it off and on again. So we do occasionally have to pull it back, or if it gets some seaweed caught in its propellers, we have to pull it back to actually get the seaweed out of the propellers. Dimitri said for the connection to the video. And it's really important that we can see on our screen, on our remote control, the video of where the ROV is, because it can be 100 meters away. We might not be able to see it. Even if it's 3 or 4 meters away under the water, we can't see it. So having the connection, the video coming through the cable back up to the remote control is really important. So we can measure how deep it's going. Yeah, so as well as the video, we also get those sensor readings, how deep it is, what direction it's pointing with a compass. William said electricity. So the ROV has a battery, the remote control also has a battery, but as a backup, we can actually also plug it in and have just a tiny little bit of electricity running through to power it. So that's a backup, but it's definitely something we can do. And oh, Jaden, that's a great answer, to send a signal from the controller to the ROV so it knows where to move. So when you are using the controller, you might tell it to go left, and the signal goes down that long tether, down the long tether to the ROV to tell it where to move. So it's really important that we actually connect together. If you've ever driven a remote control car or a drone in the sky, you might not have had a tether, and that's because signals actually work really well in the air, like radio waves, but they don't work particularly well in the water. So the water tends to block and muck them all up. So that's why it's really important that we have a tether to do all of those things. Now, those are challenges that engineers solved when they built these ROVs. What are some other challenges that engineers, builders, inventors might have to solve when building an ROV? What do we think might be a problem that they have to solve? Oh, those are some good ones. I'll give everyone a couple more moments to think if they can think of anything else. All right. Feel free to keep putting a few other answers in the chat there. But year 3 for Morissette have actually said waterproof, and that's one of the biggest challenges. William just said the exact same thing, to stop water from getting in. Water is really, really, really important that we make sure this is all sealed. So the deep trekker here is all sealed up by the company that made it. So hopefully water won't get in. It's all super glued, and we don't have to do any maintenance. We don't have to get in there, and we need to make sure that the water doesn't get into it. Now, the other interesting thing about water is the water in our harbour, the water in Sydney Harbour, the water in the ocean is salty. And salt water can actually do some really bad stuff to metal if you leave it in there for a long time. So has anyone ever seen rust? Yeah, so there's similar chemical reactions called corrosion that actually happens to metal when it's in the water, particularly salty water. And so we've got to stop corrosion. And that's why it's really important that we also wash and dry our ROVs in fresh water after we use them. All right. Okay, what else have we got? Dimitri said to try and prevent stuff getting stuck in the camera. That's a really, really good one as well. So with the ROV that we use here, we've got a nice smooth Perspex cover over the camera, and that actually stops anything really getting stuck on the front of the ROV. But we do occasionally get seaweed stuck in the propellers and things like that. And so that's something we have to think about as well if things are getting stuck in the propeller. So what we have to do is we have to pull it back in using a tether, very gently, of course, and we have to then very carefully take the seaweed out from around the propellers. This is a good one, Danielle, durability and weight. So durability means that we need to make sure it lasts for a long time and doesn't break. And they're getting a little bit scratched up because they do hit things when they're driving around underwater. And so we've got to make sure that it can withstand that and won't break. So they're all made of metal and a hard acrylic so that it's not going to shatter or anything like that. And the other thing is weight. But I said earlier, this ROV is over 8 kilos. That's quite heavy. What do we think might happen if I put something that's 8 kilos in the water? Okay, in your classrooms, hands up if you think it would sink. If you think something 8 kilos is going to sink, put your hand up. All right, hands down. Put your hand up if you think it's going to float if it's 8 kilos. All right. So we might have got a bit of a mix of answers there. And this is actually really surprising. When you put the ROV in the water, it actually floats because it's got a giant balloon of air inside it. So if anyone was to put a balloon in water, that floats. It's all the air in here. So we actually need a balance. We want it not too heavy and not too light. We want it to be able to still be able to swim down and go under the water. So we actually have little weights that we can adjust to make it the right weight compared to how buoyant it is, how much air is inside it. So it's all these forces which are really, really interesting there. And Ezekiel's also said forces, because not only are we have the forces that like buoyancy that's going to help it float, we also have the force of all of the weight on top of it. And that's why this particular ROV can only go down about 200 meters. If it goes even further down, it runs the risk of getting squished. Just like if humans were to dive down too far underwater, the humans would get squished. So the force of all of the water is being really heavy on top of you. And so the water pressure is really, really something that we have to think about when we're designing ROVs. All right, we also have battery life. Yeah, so you've got to think about, of course, the bigger the battery, the heavier it's going to be, the more expensive it's going to be. So you've got to think about how much battery life you need. And so these ones are totally fine for what we use them for here at the museum. And we come, after we finish using them for a day, we come back inside, wash them, dry them. And then once they're dry, we can actually plug them back in to power up a bit before the next time we use them. So battery life is a really interesting one. And Ezekiel's also said to make it not look like bait so the fish won't eat it. Yeah, we don't want fish to eat it. We don't want it to look like food. So yeah, we make it kind of not look like something they want to eat, but we also don't want it to scare them away too much. So that's another thing we've got to think about, because we want to have a look at them. Yeah, and the rope might break. So the rope, the tether might break. Yeah, so interestingly, this one here is black, and that's because it's got a cover over it, which is really, really strong, and so that won't break. Whereas Over here, this is yellow, so it's nice and yellow, so we can see it in the water. But it's pretty strong, but not quite as strong as the black cover on this one. So we've got to make it nice and strong so it won't break. And yeah, we want to try and make them nice and quiet. We don't want them to disturb. We don't want them to hurt any of the fish or any of the sea creatures that we see. And the last thing I'll say is that we also want to make sure that these, whatever ROVs, whatever types of technology we're using, aren't going to have any negative impact on the environment. So it's not going to leave any litter behind it. It's not going to leak any oil or chemicals or anything like that. It's not going to hurt any fish or damage anything. We want to make sure it leaves the environment exactly as it found it. Except sometimes it might take samples. So when scientists use ROVs, they might use them to take samples so that scientists can study things up close. And if we actually look at how scientists use ROVs, let me just click through here. This is a photo of an ROV that's about the size of a small car. So about the size and the weight of a small car. It's called Sebastian, and it's owned by a company called the Schmidt Ocean Institute. And they are a group of scientists that actually have a boat called the research vessel Falcor 2, the second boat. And they use that to actually go around and do science. And so Sebastian is a different type of ROV that they use to actually go and explore and take samples underwater. And it can actually go 4,500 meters below the surface. It can go so much deeper than our ROVs here. And it can see things like this glass octopus. So this is a glass octopus that it went down deep, deep, deep underneath the ocean and it took photos of. So our scientists are using ROVs to actually go and explore. And I also like something about Sebastian is that sometimes they'll even have a video and a live stream that you can watch and you can see them really driving it around. And that's quite a fun thing to do as well. Another thing that ROVs are really useful for is history, archaeology, looking for shipwrecks. And earlier this year, scientists used ROVs just like these, except bigger, to actually find a shipwreck called Endurance. And if anyone's a little bit older, years 5, 6, you might have learned about Antarctica. This shipwreck is in Antarctica. It was a shipwreck from an explorer named Shackleton, and the ship sunk. It got crushed in some ice until it sunk. But scientists were able to go down to Antarctica and use ROVs to find it. And that's another thing, another challenge that ROVs might have to solve is being in really cold places or being in really hot places. They might go to places like hydrothermal vents underneath the ocean that might be really hot, or go down to Antarctica or the Arctic where it's really, really cold, and being able to operate in those conditions is really important for some ROVs. And my last example is not so much scientists, but is about movies. So anyone here watched a movie called Titanic? So there's a movie called Titanic, and in that movie, we actually see the real shipwreck of the Titanic. And James Cameron, the director, actually invented an ROV that could deal with it's very, very deep where Titanic is, but was the perfect size to fit through the window of the ship. He went and got the ship plans, he measured how big the windows were, and he made his ROV perfectly sized to fit through the window so it could actually look inside the shipwreck of the Titanic. And he used that in the movie. So really clever, trying to make it an ROV small enough to be able to get in there. But of course, that ROV just had to have some really good cameras on it. wasn't taking scientific samples, whereas Sebastian is all about, doesn't need to be small, but it does need to have really precise scientific instruments to be able to do real science. So when we're inventing things, we've got to think about the end use. We've got to think about why it's being used. So this has been kind of an intro into this one piece of technology that helps us understand our ocean environments. You can have a look here at our beautiful harbour, some of the different things that we find, and think about if you have any last questions. Does anyone have any last questions about ROVs or technology or how we use them at the museum? Make sure you pop those in the question and answer. I like this video of all of the massive school of fish and all the different seaweed. And this is a different species of fish, the stripy ones.
And so we do have a question that's come through about how many species of sea worms do we find every year? But it may be just a bit more in general, how many new species of marine animals are found each year?
Yeah, let me just stop my screen sharing there. Oh, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but it's like, I think it's like a couple of hundred. Like it's lots of species every single year. And a lot of them are in our oceans or they're invertebrates. So they're things like insects and things that are really small. But a lot are in our oceans simply because we do know more about Mars than we do our oceans, which is really surprising to some people.
Absolutely. And for those of you that are interested in sea worms, if you go to the Australian Museum website, they've got a specialist. And in her career at the Australian Museum over 40 years, I think it might even be 50s, she's identified over, I think, 300 or 400 species of marine worms. So there would be information there. Now, Blaze is very keen to know what sharks eat.
So I'm sure if an ROV went near a shark, it would be quite interested in it, particularly if it was kind of poking at it. So of course, sharks, there are lots of different species of sharks that eat lots of different types of food. And sharks are like a lot of people. And if something weird is in their environment, they might be a little bit interested in it. And actually, I remember when we first got our little ROVs, our Trident ROVs, the people who made this actually said they had been using it in an area with some sharks, and a shark had tried to take a bit of a bite out of one. So more it's kind of if you stick anything in the face of a shark, it's going to try and work out what it is and might have a little bit of a bite at it. But that's also telling us to be really aware of our sea creatures. We want to be respectful to them. So if I see something like a fish, we're not going to drive the ROV straight at it. We're going to try and stay still and just leave it and try and let it come to us. Let it kind of, we don't want to chase it or hurt it. And sharks are the same. So I haven't been lucky enough to see a shark with one of our ROVs, but yeah. And sharks eat lots of different types of food, different species all across the world. So, but thankfully they don't eat metal.
So what do you do? And I know you've mentioned this a little bit, but what do you do when an ROV gets stuck or tangled in the seaweed?
Very good question. So the ROVs actually do get tangled quite a lot because, of course, they've got a tether, and it's why it's really careful. So I think the one behind me here, which you may not be able to see, has a claw. So hopefully you can all see there's a claw there. And the claw is really useful for actually getting itself untangled. So you can actually kind of use the claw and open it a bit and try and grab the tether and pull it off whatever it's tangled in. The other great thing about it being tethered is if, for example, sometimes with our propellers here, we actually get the seaweed in here caught around the propeller. See the propeller there. So the seaweed actually does often get sucked in there and caught and twisted around. and then that propeller just stops working. We don't want it to get damaged. So the computer does a really clever thing where it realizes something's wrong and just stops it working. It just stops. And so what we have to do then is we have to pull it back in with its tether and turn the motors off so we don't get our fingers hurt, and then just pull out all the seaweed that's caught around it. So thankfully we haven't actually got it stuck in the bottom of the ocean caught up in seaweed yet. And if that was the case, we'd have to actually send some divers down to go and rescue it, which we did do with our old ROVs. They don't have a claw. Occasionally they got caught in things that they couldn't get themselves out of. So occasionally, if it gets stuck too badly, we have to send someone in, or maybe if it's not too deep, someone with a long hook can actually try and get it unstuck.
Excellent. And that answered Blaze's question about what happens when the entire thing gets stuck. So sometimes you've just got to physically go down and get it. And yeah, hope it's not too deep. I can imagine that, you know, in some places they would have another ROV that they, if it was deep, and they could maybe go and try to rescue the other one and hope they don't get that one stuck too.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that I actually have done with our ones with a claw. Is one of the ROVs with a claw got stuck around the pylons of one of our wharves. Some kids were driving it and got a little bit lost. Not their fault at all. And the tether was actually caught on some oysters as well. So it was really, really tricky spot. And so I had to use one ROV to actually go and get it with the claw and pull it off. And yeah, so using two ROVs, it's why it's good that we have multiple now, that they can help each other.
That would have been probably a very stressful but funny in hindsight moment. So
it was also raining at the time.
Of course it was. So we've got year 3 from Morissette is wondering, so how do you work them? Is it just simply the remote control, or is there joysticks, or?
Yeah, so the deep tracker ROVs that are the ones we're using at the moment, they have 2 joysticks on the front. So one is kind of your left, right, forwards, backwards. So if we're thinking kind of a flat plane, it's forwards, backwards, left, right. And the other one is your up and down. So if you want to go up and down, you use the second joystick. And then there's joysticks on the back. It's a bit hard to see.
Yes.
It's the joysticks on the back there. And that's how we use the claw. So the claw open and close. It's also how we control the camera, because the camera can point up and down. And then there's programmable buttons that do different things. So it is a little bit complicated, but it's also surprising how quickly, if you've got kind of reasonable hand-eye kind of coordination, it's surprising how quickly, and most kids that we use these during our school holiday programs. We also use these for occasional for school groups. It's surprising, even in 2 or 3 minutes, people can get the hang of driving them around. Using the claw takes a little bit more practice. But within 10, 15 minutes, you kind of can learn everything and learn how to drive them pretty well.
Yeah, and that's pretty much answered Ezekiel's question was, do you have to be a specialist to control it? So you can learn, like you can learn any other remote controlled device. Yeah.
And of course, if you're going to go and be a scientist on a research ship, they have specialists who learn those specific really high-tech ones. But these are good. The ones that we have here at the museum, they're kind of very basic. And I have seen a question there about how much they cost. So the ones, our deep tracker ones, are about $10,000 to $15,000, and that's in American. So however the exchange rate is working at the moment. So they're not cheap, but they're not super expensive. And sometimes people will be using them, for example, for work, for inspecting the bottom of boats or big water tanks or things like that. So people do use them to actually do their jobs.
And they last a while, don't they? So it's kind of an investment if you are using it, you know, as you do for work and for other clients. And what about some of those really sort of big National Geographic ones? They're in the millions of dollars, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. So if you the big scientific ships, I don't even know if you could put a price on them, because they're invented specifically for that purpose. But also it's often good that those sorts of research, for example, when they went and found endurance in Antarctica, they had to have particular sponsors that would actually help pay for that finding that shipwreck. And so, yeah, to do all of that sort of stuff, it gets really, really expensive. But thankfully for us, yeah, as I said, the first ones we had were a couple of $1,000s each, but they were a cheaper one, and we did find they had a few more problems, particularly with the salt water actually destroying the motors, as we had to keep replacing the motors and keep fixing them up. Salt water is really, really bad for electronics and metal and things. It's really challenging to design things for that. So that's why we decided to spend a little bit more money, as I said, between $10,000 and $15,000 for the slightly more expensive ones that for us have been a lot easier because they're a lot easier for us to take care of.
Fabulous. And one of the other questions was, how long have ROVs been used? When were the first commercial ones, I guess?
So I actually don't know the answer to that. I know the company that we bought these from is, I think it's about 10 to 15 years old, the company. So definitely kind of early 2000s, they started to become more popular, but I'm sure scientists would have been using them for much, much longer. If we think about like going down and looking at the wreck of the Titanic and things like that, yeah, scientists will have been using them for a little while longer. I'm not actually sure about the exact date.
And there probably isn't really an exact date. It was one of those sort of, the technological changes and being able to use them. Certainly if you look at any sort of deep sea documentary or any underwater documentary, you'll probably be able to pick up once they start getting from manned submersibles to unmanned submersibles in some of those. We have just a final few questions. Have you gone on any missions, including diving?
So personally, I'm not a scuba diver. It's something that hopefully in the future at some point, but I love being an educator. I love talking about all of these different things. But we do have both maritime archaeologists and a couple of scientists who work who are curators here at the museum. And so we actually do have maritime archaeologists that work here, and they'll go on missions and dive on shipwrecks. And yeah, we also, one thing we at the Maritime Museum do a lot of is we actually work with other organizations. So I've been lucky enough to actually talk to scientists who work at the Schmidt Ocean Institute, to also talk to scientists who work on CSIRO's research vessel, which is RV Investigator, which actually just visited Sydney in the school holidays. And so we actually talk a lot to those scientists as well. So it's great that we can actually, as a museum, really celebrate the work of lots of different scientists that happen all around Australia.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I just wanted to add about what someone was saying about diving and missions and those kinds of things. And we mentioned it in our last session as well. The things that you're passionate about today can be something that you continue to do your job in. So I am a scuba diver, and I've been scuba diving for over 30 years. And I actually learnt when I was in high school as part of a marine studies course. And even though, in one session ago, I was talking about that I started my rock collection when I was 4 years old, my love of the marine life started even earlier than that. And I'm an avid snorkeler, going around rock pools, swimming in the ocean, scuba diving all around the world. And it's something that has stayed with me my entire life. So if it is something you're interested in, some of those jobs that Megan was just talking about, being a science communicator and an educator, being a marine archaeologist and a marine scientist, these are all jobs that you can do if you're passionate about this topic. So just remember, the things that you love now can be something that you have your career in the future for. But thank you so much, Megan, for sharing all of that fabulous technological knowledge with the ROVs, and yeah, some of the images that are coming back from around the world using these amazing technology. Someone just asked about the colossal squid squid, well, that's something that they've been able to capture some of these amazing animals through these ROVs that they wouldn't have been able to see before. So there's lots of information out there that you can find and research, and we will share a copy of the recording and some links to the Australian National Maritime Museum with you as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And yeah, that's the end of our student programs for Earth Science Week. So thank you to everyone that's been involved, and any teachers around. We have our teacher professional development session coming up shortly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.